Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the second panel on the role of lobbying in meeting global challenges. My name is Julio Basio Terracino. I'm acting head of a division here at the OECD and one of the main authors of the report that we are launching today. I'm delighted to be with so many participants attending this virtual conference, which is a testament to the central role that lobbying plays in our lives, many times without us knowing. And this is exactly the objective of this panel, to show in concrete terms how lobbying is connected to key issues that affect our lives. Lobbying is a double-edged sword. It can greatly advance an issue by providing new information, ideas, solutions, but it can also block progress on any issue by providing covert or misleading evidence or manipulating public opinion, or simply by occupying all the space of influence and not allowing others to participate. On the previous panel, I think we heard a lot about the risks that comes with this undue influence or monopoly of influence. This session will actually address both of these sides. We will discuss with experts and business representatives in 4 key policy areas: environment, health, technology, and finance. So let me introduce our panelists. We are here today with Dylan Tanner, Executive Director and co-founder of Influence Map. We are also here with Chiara Colesanti, Senni, Monetary Policy Fellow, Council on Economic Policies. Facundo Etchebehere, Vice President and Global Public Affairs and Corporate Affairs of Danone. And Linda Moore, President and CEO, TechNet. So thank you very much to our panelists. Welcome. And let's get right into the discussion. If I can start with you, Dylan. You and the Influence Map team have carried out research on influence on climate policies. Can you please introduce us to lobbying in the context of the climate sphere, and how does it happen, and what are the consequences?
Sure, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to speak. I want to congratulate the OECD on its lobbying in the 21st century release, a great contribution to this, and I think it'll be very influential. Influence Map is a nonprofit think tank in London, New York, and Tokyo, and we've developed a platform to measure climate policy influencing activities of the world's largest companies and their trade associations, and our data feeds into investor and media and other processes. First, I would say we don't advocate that who is allowed to lobby or not. I mean, I think lobbying is a legitimate process, and we just track the relative impact that the corporate sector has on this agenda, and I will explain why this is important. It's motivated by the fact that the world's climate scientists under the IPCC say we need strong and binding policy urgently to address climate, and there remains a glaring lack of such binding policy, even as the physical impacts of climate change get more worrying. Our research shows a major reason for this has been the opposition from parts of the corporate sector over the last 2 decades, since the Kyoto Agreement and past the Paris Agreement. And our research shows this opposition lobbying, while the tactics of change, remains very active. An important part of our methodology, and something the new OECD report notes, is a wider definition of the term lobbying than may be commonly considered and has been discussed today. We use a UN protocol issued in 2014 called a Guide to Engagement with Climate Policy, but the concepts apply to any area of government policy. And it includes the activities of the term lobbying that you may be familiar with, direct communications with policymakers and regulators, but it also includes advertising, PR, and importantly, social media and the funding of research, all which is designed to shape the narrative and discourse in which policymakers are acting. And it includes the funding of research, and it includes political contributions and revolving doors. And very crucially, it also includes the utilization of industry associations and other external actors to conduct all of these influencing activities. So our work tracks all of these things in the context of climate change policy. And the results point to a picture which shows that despite numerous top-line statements of support from the corporate sector for net zero and the Paris agreements, there remains a profound amount of opposition to the immediate climate policy action the scientific community says we need. and many governments have been trying to implement. So what does this look like in real terms? Well, we have a vast database of companies and their lobbying, but you may be familiar with a decades-long process by the oil and gas and heavy emitters beginning in the 80s to discredit climate science. So this is around the narrative capture. This has now given way to more subtle climate policy delay. In 2016, the flagship of the US climate agenda, the Clean Power Plan, was shot down by a lawsuit from the US Chamber of Commerce. Similarly, Europe's emissions trading scheme suffered from a decade of continual watering down by heavy industry, who succeeded in securing free emission permits, which limited the incentive to decarbonize. And the efforts by the automotive sector to control and even defraud emissions regulation over the last decade are well known. So our data shows this delaying lobbying continues, and it's targeting pipelines of binding climate regulations and policy measures being proposed in the US, the EU, the Green Deal, and the UK. And it's largely now driven by a minority group of companies in the fossil fuel value chain. So we're at a critical time as we head into COP26 in Glasgow. And many observers say this is the last real chance governments have of implementing an orderly and policy-driven transition to low carbon. So it's absolutely critical to have a clear understanding of policy influencing from the corporate sector, so various stakeholders, including investors and others, can act on this information.
Thank you. Thanks, Dylan. Some terms that you highlighted, like opposition lobbying, I would like to highlight myself, the narrative capture. And well, you're painting a rather worrying picture. But as you said yourself, so this is a minority group of companies that are capturing some of the discussion. So we'll go back to this point. Chiara, now if your work has focused on the financial sector and climate. What are the key issues at stake in this field that you see market participants engaging in, and what concrete impacts can this have in our daily life?
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm working at the Council on Economic Policies, which is a sustainability think tank based in Zurich. And my work mostly focuses on monetary policy and financial supervision. So yes, as Julio said, like the topic of climate risk and how to measure it is getting increasingly relevant for the financial sector. And that's why it's also rapidly moving up agendas of central bank and of financial supervisors. And the decision on their agenda, and thus also on the agenda of many other market participants, covers, in my view, two key policy areas, the monetary policy and financial supervision. So first, on the monetary policy side, I think the key debate is on the integration of climate considerations into the asset purchases of central banks and in their collateral framework, which in the end define what collateral central banks accept and under which conditions when commercial banks seek refinancing through them. So to carry these operations, central banks use a set of criteria which basically determine which type of assets are eligible and, for instance, which haircuts the central bank apply to the value of the collateral. And this set of criteria includes, for instance, the definition of risk threshold that assets need to meet to be eligible. And these thresholds are, as of today, set by external rating agencies, but central banks have increasingly voiced that the existing ratings do not sufficiently account for climate risk and have started to explore, to different extents, depending on the country, how they could add further climate risk metrics into their management framework to ensure that climate risks are also sufficiently reflected. And obviously, the choice of such metrics is an important one, and it's a decision on which a growing number of stakeholders are starting to engage on. I think that an additional area of discussion is the integration of climate consideration into what are called targeted refinancing operations. because targeted refinancing operations are instruments through which central banks provide liquidity to banks to refinance certain segments of their loan books. And the ECB, for instance, has adopted such targeted refinancing operation to support loans to the real economy, but excluding mortgages. The Bank of England similarly has used targeted refinancing operation, but specifically to support loans to small and medium-sized enterprises. And what I think is that a natural extension could be to introduce climate consideration in the choice of the targeting, for example, by supporting loans for energy efficiency measures in the real estate sector, or based on the European taxonomy. And I think that also whether and how to design such a scheme for a refinancing operation will increasingly be an area that many stakeholders will engage on. Moving now instead to the financial supervision side, I think that financial supervisors and central banks in their role as financial supervisors are exploring to what extent climate risks are accounted for in the assessment of individual financial institutions and for the stability of the financial system as a whole. Again, as before, the starting point for this debate is the view that climate risks are not properly reflected in the existing risk measurement, and that additional climate risk metrics need to be integrated into the supervisory processes. The addition of such metric is likely to lead to change in the risk analysis and thus in the risk weights that underpin financial supervision. This is crucial because it affects the determination of capital requirements for individual financial institutions and potentially also the introduction of systemic risk buffer, which both have costs for instance, banks. And so clearly the changes in the eligibility of assets for monetary policy, but also the change in risk assessment, which drive capital requirements, touch on core interests of financial market actors, but also on firms in the real economy and of further stakeholders. And this is because, for instance, whether the bonds of a company are eligible or not for central bank purchases or as collateral in refinancing operation has an impact on its pricing in financial markets and ultimately has an impact on the funding cost for the firm issuing these assets. And in a similar way, if financial supervisors put more emphasis on climate risk, they are likely to increase capital requirements on banks for the loans that they give to firms facing such risk, and thus in the end to increase the funding cost of these firms. That's why we have partially already started, and probably we will increase, that we see firms that are exposed to high carbon risk, for example, company in high carbon sectors engaging on the topic. But at the same time, we may be seeing firms that would benefit from lower funding costs if the climate risks are better accounted for, to be advocating for moves in the opposite direction. As an example, companies producing insulation material would profit from refinancing operation for improved energy efficiency in housing. And also, and I think crucially, if the financial industry and banks face additional costs if supervisors decide to introduce additional capital requirements, then they would also engage on that. So in general, I think that the debates on the integration of climate consideration into central banking and financial supervision is a key lens into the complex relationship between government, corporate, and financial interests in a very important policy issue of our time.
Thank you, Chiara. Actually, I like very much how you bridged sort of the climate discussion into the financial sector discussion and how these, of course, are connected. And also the way in which you illustrated what we very much present in this conference today, which is actually there's always a balance. There's the firms that perhaps and companies that are lobbying for, let's say, status quo or for one view or one way. And on the other hand, you have perhaps new actors coming in, new companies, especially in the area of the climate, which will also be lobbying for the other one. And very much what we're trying is that hopefully these balance out and in the decision of the decision maker in this case. Now, I mean, Facundo, in your experience, what is the contribution that business can make to policy making? We just touched on this in the earlier panel and also a little bit now, but from your point of view, coming from business, and what challenges or risks have you experienced from the business side?
Thanks, Julio, for inviting for this very interesting debate, and we are learning a lot from each other. So yes, let me start stating that, in fact, we need to have all these processes regarded and transparency in place, because we should not forget that a new influence and monopoly of the influence is also a problem for other companies. It's within the private sector, there are problems. So this is key. And discussions could be unbalanced, led by the unbalanced power within the private sector. And that is something always to be acknowledged. So whatever we can do to level the playing field is helping business to have a proper process and to shape, to help the decision-making process to the best. So that is the first thing. Also, assessing this complexity that is now in the system, also understanding the issues that we have in terms of trade-offs is a matter for discussion, and discussion should be nourished by different perspectives, different voices, level playing field, different voices, diversity that could bring perspective. And if we all gain perspective, we gain impact. And I will take the words of the OECD, no? So better policies for better lives. So we don't want suboptimal policies captured by some interest. We want the best possible solutions to target, to really solve what society is expecting from us. And from us all together. Maybe consumer goods were more exposed in the day-to-day to what consumers are expecting, but also stakeholders are reaching out and we need to answer. But we want to be part of the solution and we have something to say. But we need to be in a right process to be part of the right conversation. So we can bring that. We can bring a perspective. But we can bring a perspective as a private sector as part of the solution, committed to contribute with all the elements, technical aspects, alternative solutions that could enrich the discussion. So whatever we can do to protect the process is favoring all sectors, and also is favoring better outcomes. And that is our aim. And we are convinced about the opportunity to have these kind of frames fostered by OECD to leverage the impact of good lobbying.
Thank you, Facundo. Definitely, I mean, a good point. I mean, I'm happy you're illustrating the issues of undue influence and monopoly of influence, the two biggest risks in this discussion, which is also a problem within business, as you were saying, and very much that business wants and needs to be part of the conversation, part of the solution. I would actually stress very much, not only that once, but really needs to be. I mean, most of the global challenges that we face today, there's no way out without a solution that is brought or constructed together with business. You know, excluding business or any other stakeholder is actually very much against of what we are promoting in relation to transparency and integrity of lobbying. Now, Linda, turning to you, and good morning is very early for you, so thank you very much for being with us. From your point of view, how would you define your lobbying and advocacy role? How do you interact with decision makers to make the voices of business heard? And in your career, have you evidenced some of these damaging lobbying practices that we have mentioned here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for having me with you. I really appreciate it. You can see the sun rising in Washington, D.C. over my shoulder. And I know all of you are enjoying the afternoon there. So it's good to be with you all. I will describe a little bit of what TechNet is about. We represent all of the tech ecosystem. Our organization was founded back in 1997 by one Democrat and one Republican in Silicon Valley. And the organization was always meant to be a bipartisan organization, something that works with both sides of the aisle, that really lays out for policymakers the opportunities and the challenges faced by the tech industry as it deals with public policy. So TechNet has been around for a while. We have very active engagement from our member companies, all 84 of them, and also from their executives. So we have CEOs, founders, engineers, people who are really leading the innovations and leading the companies as a part of our organization, which makes our advocacy that much richer and more important and impactful. We represent all of the tech ecosystem. So we have everything from advanced energy to internet platforms, to hardware, to software, to autonomous vehicles, to fintech. We represent everything. We also have the very largest companies like Apple and Amazon and Google, but we also have small startups and medium-sized companies. And so we bring that entire breadth and depth of our entire organization and our entire membership to bear when we advocate for issues. The way that we handle our advocacy is we bring all of our members together once a year in the fall for them to all have, no matter the size of the company, to have equal weight in determining our agenda. What is our agenda? What are our priorities? What are our policy principles? And is a consensus-driven organization. The small companies have just as much impact and weight in determining those decisions as the large companies. We are a democracy, as I like to say, to all of our members, and they function that way very well together. We're very public about what our principles are. They are on our website. I think it's very important to be really honest and open and transparent about what it is you believe in and what you're advocating for. And I think that's an important thing that I wish every single organization would follow all across the world. We do federal advocacy and also 50-state advocacy. With so many of the really difficult, complex tech issues not being dealt with at the federal level, a lot of that has devolved to the states trying to handle those kinds of issues on their own. And you will see, if you've been following these kinds of things in the US, a lot of states are trying to tackle the incredibly complex issue of privacy, for example. But we have very important member companies and executives that represent a lot of what makes US globally competitive. And we take that responsibility very, very seriously. So I can tell you as an individual, I, having worked in government in the White House and in the US Senate, I was lobbied myself. I saw what is effective lobbying and I saw what is bad lobbying. And I will tell you that I never forgot those people who omitted information that I should have known, who weren't honest about the information that they should have shared, and just weren't really as transparent and honest with all the information they shared as they should have been. I can tell you that my perspective and the perspective of everyone that I respect in my sphere in DC, your reputation is everything. Your integrity is everything. If policymakers do not trust you to be an honest broker and an honest deliverer of information and the point of view of the businesses and how they operate and how they will be impacted by the policies, then you have no impact at all. So I think that the most important thing is that we all know that transparency and integrity is the foundation of good advocacy. And if you don't abide by those rules, then you're just not going to advance the ball. We have seen some comments from other panelists about how, for example, it's affected the climate debate. My members are very, very forward-leaning on climate. We use our collective strength to not only work on our issues, but also to work on climate, to work on racial justice, and also to work on diversity and inclusion and police reform. So we have very socially progressive, socially active companies. Their customers demand that, their employees demand that, and the executives want that. So that is the voice that I bring to the advocacy in Washington, D.C. and all across the 50 states in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Linda. On this, I'd like to highlight this last point that you raised, which is something that we raised also in the OECD report, which is we are also at an age of very, very high scrutiny on government officials, but also on companies, and coming from, as you said, customers, consumers, but also investors, and now perhaps always, but we see it much more now, employees. And it's this also these sort of pressures coming in or on the companies. And I like also to highlight what you said about the state level, what we call the subnational level lobbying, something that we cover in the report. And we actually, one of the points that we make is that at subnational level, there is very little transparency. But however, a lot of the decisions, as you were saying, are taken at this level of government. Mm-hmm. So a lot to do there. I'll continue with you, Linda. You were saying, you touched on this briefly, but perhaps you can enter a little bit more on how can we ensure that we have more of the good lobby, something that you were saying about honesty, etc. And also, how can we ensure that we have less of the bad one? What can governments do, and particularly what can business do?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I'll take your question in a couple of points. One is I would say that we do have compliance for our 50 state advocacy team. And so the laws are a little bit different across the states. Some are more stringent than others, but we do still have to register, disclose, be very clear about what we're engaging on. So I would say the US anyway, I think sets a good example for subnational adherence to good practices. It can always be better, but I think it's a pretty good foundation. I think that there needs to be more exposure of the bad actors. We have a pretty vigorous scrutiny from journalists here in the U.S. And so, usually when people are engaging in unscrupulous lobbying activities, they're found out and they're exposed. I would like to think that there's another way to do it other than a very rigorous, press and scrutiny, but that is where I think it's found the most. And then also, as we were talking about, the employees are much more engaged now. I saw that with the beginning of the Trump administration. Employees really have a direct line now into their CEO and C-suite, and they really follow closely the company's political contributions, who they're engaging with on Capitol Hill or in the administration in the US. And they hold them to account for that sort of thing. And they also, honestly, they look at what TechNet is doing. So it's not unheard of for Tim Cook to be made aware of what TechNet is doing on Apple's behalf. So, that kind of responsibility that I bear and that kind of scrutiny that my team and I bear, we do not take that lightly. It's very important to us. We're holding people's reputations in our hands. And I just think that for those, it's a little easier to get a little bit more fast and loose and to not be as adherent to good practices when you get into the sphere of contract lobbyists, those who are just put on retainer for a short period of time. And also even more so in the area that we see in the US a lot now, where coalitions are set up with a certain name on it. And you can go dig, if you know where to look, of who is funding it and who's really providing, all of the wind at their sails, so to speak, to get this job done. Those are usually also uncovered by the press here. So I would just say that, I think, it's very well known in DC. It's a fairly small town, who the good actors are and who the bad actors are. I would imagine it's pretty much like that in a lot of other capitals around the world. And I would like to see more scrutiny of literally untruths being put out there. We saw during the Trump administration, especially on climate policy, the ignoring of science and the promotion of the kinds of information that was put out there by the petroleum industry and other fossil fuel industries, which we were incredibly chagrined by because we're very science oriented. But that's an example of there was really no punishment for that, honestly, other than journalism exposing it for what it was, both on the Trump administration side and on the people who were providing that information. But we know who those actors are.
Thanks, Linda, for that. And Facundo, I'd like to turn to you on a slightly different issue related to business, which is something that in our report, we raised the issue of the challenge of misalignment. Misalignment between the public statement of a company and its lobbying, and sometimes misalignment between a company's position on an issue and the position of the industry association that the company is part of. And Linda was touching on this before. Like, what can companies do to overcome this misalignment?
First of all, Julio, there is no room for dissociated agendas. We are in the era of the transparency to the max, de facto. So it's not a choice. So we are exposed as companies. We need to face the reality, be part of a conversation in a positive way, and assume that we could have differences inside the institutions where we are part, and we need to state clearly what is our position. As companies, we must do that in all the topics we are involved. There is a risk of the minimum common denominator when we participate in the industry associations that is blocking the solutions. Many times we have seen this. It's not that all the companies in the industry associations are thinking the same. So that is blocking the solutions, and sometimes this unbalanced power within the same industry is leading to positions that we don't like. And the company is clear. Danone in particular, when we issued our advocacy policy in 2017, we stated clearly that we need to have senior people participating in industry association to represent well us and to state clearly what we believe, and even do the assessment when we need to leave that association. And this is a big decision. It's not easy to be taken because it's better to have a collective approach to find the solution. We believe in the collective. We do that. We do advocacy through industry association, as we do a standalone advocacy, facing the society and stating directly what we believe. But we have identified the need to create alternative ways to drive conversations. And that's the reason why we are clearly involved in multi-stakeholders coalitions. Because we need to have a goal-centric approach to tackle the issues and then to drive consistent positions. Not just being trapped in the institutional map that is inertial. If we are facing new challenges, sometimes we need to be creative in the way we articulate efforts to foster positive solutions. And that is a day-to-day challenge. And as was said before, it's not that in all the geographies is the same way to do it. Sometimes we need to be flexible, but to be consistent as a company, fostering transparency, taking care of the trust we want to build with the stakeholders, accountability, fairness, we need to have a standard. And this is a basic standard that we set for all our actions as a company, at company level, that is the advocacy policy on top of the integrity policy, on top of what we have as an employee, as a code of conduct. So all these elements are building blocks that together with the contextual policies, that means all the policy frame that you are fostering through the OECD approach, we could do the job in a proper way to achieve our goal, because we should not forget that the process is an enabler to find the best solution, these not suboptimal, optimal solutions for society.
Thank you. Thanks, Facundo. Well, it's true what you're saying, that there's a lot out there, I would say, as you were saying, that we know a lot of what are the positions of companies and what are they really lobbying for. But it is also because of that that we know that, unfortunately, still today, and I'm not saying, I mean, you don't speak for the whole business community, you're speaking mostly from your own experience, but we still see today, perhaps in the area of climate, what is informally called like greenwashing, and statements by business which are not aligned, and this is the famous misalignment with what then they lobby for, or sometimes their actions of the company. And we understand this sometimes, let's say, takes time into changing the way a corporation or a company functions and works. But there is, I would say, because of the same scrutiny that you were talking about, a need to speed up and address this misalignment, because, and what Linda was talking about earlier, this high reputation and scrutiny coming from employees, from investors again, and from consumers all. But there, I think we still have, we don't provide the solution in our report, but we still have, as you were saying, perhaps the chance to jointly look for the solution for this misalignment. A long road for now, I think.
Absolutely. Setting the fundamentals to address the issues, but also to have the proper platform to work together. So it's not about only the how. The how, you are addressing the how. Then the what has a lot of implications. And maybe the declaration from the company is a step, but we need to also address the how from the company side, not only from the process perspective. So all together is going to help us all to address the need in terms of challenges.
Thanks, Facundo. Chiara, we are talking a little bit about what we call special interest groups. So we have discussed sort of the different practices of special interest groups. Who are, in your view, the key actors that can change the game? In your research and in your work, who could be these game changers? And what can they do to address this influence?
Yeah, maybe if I may, before answering the question, just to pick up on the last point, I think a very interesting thing that we found in our research where we applied climate risk metrics to portfolio, for instance, of the ECB, was that many companies have issued assets for the core company and for the financial subsidiary. And these metrics then don't capture the risk of the financial subsidiary based on the core company. So like a cement company have a subsidiary financial, which is assessed as completely low risk because it's a financial company. And the metric doesn't pick up the relationship to the core company. I think this was, very interesting. But to go back to the question. So as it was already said, I also think that in the topic of climate risk, the engagement by multiple actors is something to observe, but also to welcome, because developing our understanding of climate-related financial risk and how to reflect it in policymaking requires all hands on deck, and including those of the industry and of many other stakeholders. So with this in mind, I think that the question on which climate risk metrics central banks and financial supervisors use and what they use them for is a critical one. And it's definitely a decision on which the financial sector has already started to have a say. I think that in this context, there is little disagreement that there is a need to strengthen the integration of climate risk metrics. And indeed, many market participants already integrate these metrics in their own operation and in the product offering. Like you can think, for example, at dedicated climate funds. But at the same time, this industry appears to be taking the position that climate risk metrics are not robust enough to be integrated into the determination of capital requirement. And I think this highlights a crucial issue to deal with in this field, that is that a lot of knowledge on how to assess climate risk sits with the financial industry. But at the same time, this sector has an interest in averting potential capital costs that the integration of climate risk into supervisory framework may bring about. And related to that, I think that there are also other stakeholders, including parliaments, academia, and civil society, that can play a role in ensuring that central banks and financial supervisors bring in this knowledge on climate risk from the private sector, but that at the same time build their own capacity to develop their views on climate risk. And in the last year, this has already improved a lot, I think, but still some progress is possible. And as an example, regulators should take a view and set standards on appropriate climate scenarios and also integrate them then into their supervision. I think it's also interesting to notice that new policies or regulation in the area of climate change and climate risk can open new fields for lobbying. Like as an example, as I guess many of you know, like the European Commission developed a taxonomy on which economic activities are environmentally sustainable or not. And this taxonomy should underpin reporting by corporation and by the financial sectors. But what happened is that this taxonomy has triggered lobbying from the industry, as we have seen, for instance, in the case of natural gas, which the industry has pushed to have included among the green activities. And I also think that central bank and financial supervisors must ensure that they listen to all the different voices and perspectives on climate risk, and this was also already said, but like in the specific regard of central banks, I think it's important to be able to answer questions like, who do central banks and financial supervisors consult when they deal with this new issue? If they primarily engage with market participants, or if they're able to bring in a wider range of voices, including those of academia or of the civil society. And I think also in this regard, there is a shift towards like more openness and listening to different voices. And last thing that I wanted to say is that I think that the concept that business interests should not go against the public interest also very much apply to climate risk and to the role that financial institutions play. In this context, investors can have an important role in scrutinizing the position of the corporates and of the financial institution that they invest in, and to use their ownership rights accordingly. As an example, investors can push for more transparency and for companies to align their lobbying activities with the public interest and with their sustainability credentials.
Thank you, Chiara. And Dylan, in your area, sort of deeper into the climate policies area, who are the key actors? I mean, we've heard from Chiara now on central banks and the financial sector, but in the climate, who are the actors that can be game changers, that can address this issue of influence of the interest groups?
Sure. So let me just give a very brief analysis of what our data shows, how this works in the climate context, and I think it's can be generalized. And you know, all stakeholder groups have a right to lobby and put their input into policy decisions. That's a democratic process, and there's clear mechanisms to doing so. But what our research suggests that is when the policy area has a profound impact on the economy, as climate does, it works in such a way that the sectors and companies most negatively impacted in the short term fight the hardest to prevent it happening, and often they fight dirty, as Linda mentioned, with the petroleum in misinformation and stuff. And we have sectors like oil and gas, utilities, and they're heavily regulated anyway by governments, so they have a lot of interactions with governments, and they have big lobbying machines, and they tend to be more effective than civil society groups, not just because of the money, but because they come to the table saying we represent jobs and growth. And if you do this against our sector, that will impact that. And policymakers are hugely impacted by that message. And so they tend to have the largest megaphone. Other sectors like healthcare, finance, technology, they're very powerful also. But our data shows they haven't really deployed that lobbying machine on the climate issue yet. And it's encouraging to hear Linda's comments. The TechNet, is doing this. That needs to happen more. And just this dynamic of disproportional representation, it's also evident in the microcosm of these cross-sector groups like the US Chamber and the Japan Business Federation, where the lowest common denominator positions of a minority group often prevail over issues where that impacts that negative group. And this explains why those groups have such regressive positions on climate that are not represented by some of the apparently more powerful members like technology and finance and healthcare in those groups. So how can this change? And the most direct lever is, of course, the companies themselves. Non-fossil fuel sectors like the ones I mentioned are all effective lobbyists. The leadership of those companies can instruct their regulatory affairs to prioritize climate change and make it one of the top 1 or 2 issues. They all have their own issues, and everyone understands that. But until climate becomes one of those, then that may not happen. And crucially, also exert their influence within those powerful cross-sector groups I mentioned, and to get the majority view represented as opposed to the minority view, which has happened in the past. Another lever that Chiara mentioned is the investment community. And so the owners of these companies who are doing the negative lobbying, there's a collective engagement program called Climate Action 100 Plus, with 500 institutional investors and over $50 trillion in assets. So essentially half of all equity markets. And they have a powerful voice collectively. And this is something that hasn't happened in the past, and it's the largest engagement program in history, any topic. And they prioritize the lobbying issue, and they are demanding reform of governance by companies on this. And a key initial demand is full disclosure of lobbying positions and misalignments and the things that have been discussed. So a promising development, but this needs to happen more quickly in the climate context to help things along.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we are a bit pressed for time, so I'll do a last round, a very quick round, 1 minute each, if I can, to prioritize, to tell us, the OECD, as we said earlier, we are going to be revising the principles for transparency and integrity in lobbying, and expanding its scope, most probably, and including issues of social media, investors, and many of the things that have been discussed so far. But in your view, what are the key elements that should be included in these revised principles in order to ensure a more constructive engagement between governments and business? Maybe can I start with you, Dylan?
Yeah, so firstly, you said expand the scope of the definition of lobbying to include all of these other activities. And secondly, to make disclosures binding, because voluntary efforts have failed so far to produce this information. And I would say what they need to disclose is what policy issues materially affect your business, and what are your detailed positions on these policy areas, and put those in clear public view. And then conduct an audit of your external lobbyists and declare any misalignments. And this information, when assessed by third-party entities like ourselves and others and auditors, can go a long way to redressing this.
Thank you, Dylan. Thanks very much. Chiara?
Yes. So I think my recommendation mostly relates to the implementation of these principles. And I think I could say something, sorry, related to transparency and to the importance that all the different stakeholders are heard. So as for transparency, I think that the process must be transparent when it relates to integration of climate risk, and guarantee that all the different voices are heard. And there must be, for instance, clarity about the target and methods used to achieve them. Also, as I said before, on who the decision makers in central banks and financial supervisors are. And similarly, there should be clarity on how different actors are affected. Can you hear me well? Because I hear an echo.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And on how like different actors are affected by this change in the risk management framework or in the monetary policy operations. I gave some example before, but many other channels exist. However, just related to that, I think we also need to ensure that this call for transparency does not kill the conversation. Because as I mentioned before, I think that the interaction with external stakeholders, such as financial institutions, NGOs, and academia, is crucial to bring forward the debates on the integration of climate risk metrics within central banks and financial supervision. But if the request for transparency reached a level at which central bankers were to face significant reporting requirements for each conversation that they have, and then they may become less open to engage in a discussion, these would be counterproductive. And just briefly on the first principle of the OECD, that countries should provide a level playing field. I think that these must obviously also apply to central bank, and maybe not only in relation to the integration of climate risk, what I focus on today, but with regard to the broader array of decisions that central banks and financial supervisors take, and that in the end affects all our life. And it is clear that financial institutions provide important inputs to this decision process, but probably other stakeholders should gain also an equal voice.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chiara. Facundo, what are the key elements that should be included in the OECD principle?
I won't repeat what is already in the report that is very complete. Thanks for that. But I would like to add that it sometimes we are looking at the transparency side of the process, but not at the inclusion side of the process or the timing side of the process that is enabling a proper process. So there is something that we need to learn about what are the best practices of inclusion, science included in the process, the fair share of voice in the process to achieve a clear goal. Define the goal, also all the pipeline on the articulation of these conversations to arrive there. So sometimes there are some processes defined in a formal way that are not respected by the authorities, that are just to tick the box that they are doing. And this is leaving room for informal influence that we want to avoid. So it's a question of learning from what is working and what is not working in the process, beyond reassuring the transparency that for sure is a key element, but also we don't want to have processes where we have a formality like an open consultation and then everything ignored, and you can follow some bias in the way it's driven the outcome.
Thank you, Facundo. And Linda, if you can close with your views on the key elements.
Yes, I would really urge that all countries have the same kind of standards that the US do as a baseline. So I would say that every lobbyist has to report quarterly, and we report to the government, and those records are public. So I can go on at any time and I can search by the lobbyist or search by the entity, and I can see who is lobbying and advancing what entity's interests. That is very accessible to everyone here. It's also punishable by law if you do not adhere to that. So it has teeth to it. I would also say that everyone should have to report political contributions, and those also should be public. That is definitely the case here, so that if you ever want to follow the money, so to speak, on who's contributing to who and who might have, influence to gain with someone, that is very easy to see here. It's also punishable by law if you do not follow, all of the disclosure and reporting and the limits. And then there's also a very, very much a focus on any lobbyists who are lobbying on behalf of a foreign government. That is a very tight screen. It's reported very clearly and separately. So I would have that be definitely reported, obviously, but public as well. So I would say those are all the things that I would recommend. In addition, when I worked in the US Senate for 10 years and also in the White House for 8 years, I had to, as an employee, fill out a very detailed financial disclosure report every year. So that if anyone wanted to see if there was any kind of conflict of interest in terms of how I was viewing things, it was there as a part of the record. So I would also include that if you want to have more transparency disclosure for government officials as well.
Thank you, Linda, and thanks to all of you for the very interesting discussion, and also for giving us so many elements for our work forward in this area. Perhaps I'll highlight just one from each of you. The disclosure should be binding, the level playing field on transparency across countries. The call for transparency should not reduce the conversation. And I will end with the point that what we need is more and better political engagement. And definitely we should not be reducing it. So thanks very much to the four of you again. We are closing now this panel, and to our audience, we will take a 5-minute break, only 5 minutes, to stretch your legs, and then we will come back with the last panel on foreign influence, addressing foreign influence in public decision making and electoral process. So in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.